Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to CineHistorians. This is the 7th main episode of Season 1. If you're just joining us for the first time, this is another episode in our season focusing on new waves. And this is quite exciting because it's the first of two episodes, Raquel, isn't it, that we're doing about films from the New Hollywood era. And this time out, we're looking at a biggie. It's 1967's The Graduate. So, like I said, Raquel, quite exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, we've taken a trip around the world. Now we're coming back to Hollywood.
Yeah, back in time and over to Hollywood, absolutely. And Raquel, just before we get into setting the scene, there's just one word I want to say to you. Just one word. Plastics. Mm-hmm. There's a great future in plastics, Raquel. Think about
there
it.
There is.
What do you think about it? Anyway, we'll come back maybe to plastics at some point in the ensuing discussion. Right. I apologize in advance, Raquel, for what might be quite a lengthy introduction to New Hollywood, because it's my turn to set the scene with this cinematic movement. And there's a lot to say here, I think. So feel free, Raquel, to jump in at some point in this monologue that's about to hit you. Where to start? I think to determine how New Hollywood came about, we probably need to start with talking about Old Hollywood. And in the classical Hollywood era, you know, the major studios like MGM, made films on an industrial scale. They had extensive labor pools of producers, directors, writers, performers, technical staff. And the efforts of all of these people allowed the studios to turn out many films a month during the peak years of the studio system in the 30s and 40s. Raquel and I are both big admirers of the classic Hollywood period. There are many films from that system that we like very much, some of which we've podcasted about elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But what changed? What meant that the old Hollywood system crumbled? Well, it's a tangled tale. So one of the first things to point out, I think, is that over time, the economic power of the studios kind of became blunted. So there's a Supreme Court ruling in the late 40s known as the Paramount Decree. This brought about an end to the practice of so-called vertical integration. It separated the big studios from the cinema chains that they owned. And this meant that the market for Hollywood's films couldn't be guaranteed in the same way. Also, what happens over time is cinema going becomes a bit less central to American life. So 1946, I believe, is the high watermark of film as a mass medium in terms of admissions. That's the year that attendances peaked. The figure I've seen is about 90 million tickets sold a week. So astonishing numbers of tickets. By 1960, that figure had dropped quite dramatically. And again, the figure I've seen is about 40 million. So Still considerable amounts of tickets being sold every week, but a big decline. And why might that have happened? Well, again, it's a complex tale, but the rise of television is probably a big factor. Shifting geographical patterns, you know, people moving to suburban areas and increasingly staying in to watch TV instead of going to the cinema once or twice every week. So Hollywood has a downturn in demand. It has to respond to that downturn. And it does so by making fewer films, by tightening budgets, by streamlining numbers of staff. So by the late 50s, you kind of get to the point where that assembly line style of filmmaking, that's kind of what we think about as classic Hollywood, that starts to fall apart. You get technical developments, you get the use of 3D, you get the adoption of widescreen formats to try and differentiate from television, but TV becomes really firmly established. And, you know, you get the production of some large-scale films spiraling out of control. Probably Cleopatra in 1963 is the most famous example. The highest grossing film of the year, but didn't turn a profit on first release because it cost so much to make. So during this period, Hollywood's still quite reliant on some tried and tested formulas. And it's a time when elsewhere there's a spirit of innovation. And we've talked about things like the French New Wave, of course, on this podcast. That isn't quite what's happening in Hollywood during the early 60s, although it's still producing significant films during the late 50s and 60s, of course. If you look at lists of greatest films of all time, you'll see films like Hitchcock's Vertigo, which was number one in Sight and Sound's list in 2012, fell to number 2 in 2022. Actually, Vertigo is quite an interesting example because Alfred Hitchcock felt apparently that the fact that James Stewart was aging was a reason for the lack of success there, relative lack of financial success. So it's a time when great figures of the classic Hollywood era are getting a bit older. And that's not just on-screen talent, it's also producers. You know, many old Hollywood moguls kind of cling to power for a long time. But it's a time when the culture is changing, it's a time when the industry is changing, and it's a time when new approaches were needed. So you get kind of to the second half of the 60s, and the studios are in a really poor financial state and begin to be bought up by bigger conglomerates whose primary interest lies in other fields besides film. So an example would be Gulf and Western buying Paramount, for example, when Gulf and Western really were about manufacturing and resource extraction. So you get upheavals, and this means that there are staffing changes. It means there are new executives, and it means that there are people who are maybe a bit younger, maybe a bit more inclined to take a few risks. It didn't mean that these incoming executives knew exactly how to turn things around, but they were at least aware that, you know, there are artistic films abroad like Michelangelo Antonioni's film Blow Up or something that are achieving a bit of cultural cachet. And, you know, you got these new executives coming in Hollywood wanting to kind of tap into some of that. So there's confusion about what filmgoers in America want, and there are executives who are wanting to turn that around and are increasingly willing for a time to give a bit of power to directors. And that's one of the key aspects of this paradigm shift, I think. More broadly, of course, the 60s, it's a very tumultuous decade in the United States. It's the era of the civil rights movement. It's the era of the Kennedy assassination and, you know, the assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. There's the sexual revolution, the contraceptive pill first being approved for use in the US in the 60s. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which is challenging assumptions about what the proper role of women is. Of course, the Cold War, American involvement in Vietnam. So there are all these things going on.
There's a lot going on.
A lot going on, a lot of things relating to race and class and gender and age and the age of the counterculture. Cinema is developing in an interesting direction because it maybe goes in a more violent sexual direction. So you can sort of see this at the outset of the 60s in a way with the shower scene murder in Psycho. You can kind of see that as a watershed moment that's pointing ahead. And then you get later into the 60s and the production code, which had dictated what could be depicted on screen since the 1930s. I mean, it now seems increasingly irrelevant. It's replaced with the MPAA system in 1968. So you have a convergence of factors that point in a way away from old Hollywood and towards new Hollywood. So a long, drawn-out collapse, basically, of the Hollywood studio system of old. And it provides an opening for directors to assert themselves. And in the book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, the author Peter Biskind, he kind of defines the new Hollywood era as 1967, which is the year of The Graduate, the year of Bonnie and Clyde, up to around 1980, which is the year of Michael Cimino's chaotic financial mega flop Heaven's Gate. And the kind of argument is that after Heaven's Gate, Hollywood becomes increasingly corporatized in the 80s, and that's to the detriment of artistic achievement. As ever, it's worth pointing out, I think we've done this on a few episodes, that labeling where these movements start and end is difficult to do really precisely. But I think Biskind's categorization is not a bad one. So you get the new Hollywood era, like I say, films like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, Easy Rider, The Godfather, Nashville, The Exorcist, Taxi Driver, Jaws, Star Wars, and that's by no means an exhaustive list. This is a movement where you could have a really long list of like notable movies, I think. Right, so what defines the new Hollywood era? And I will throw it over back to Raquel to introduce The Graduate eventually, I promise, but just a bit more time on what defines new Hollywood. It's a time when you get, a new breed of high-profile directors, and what's interesting about them is they tended to have a different kind of outlook than many earlier directors. So they're kind of getting their start in different ways. There are many directors like Martin Scorsese who had attended film schools, which were kind of popular at this time. So Scorsese had been to New York University. I think someone like George Lucas at the University of Southern California. Paul Schrader had started work as a critic. He wrote a book called Transcendental Style in Film about several directors before he became a filmmaker. And these people were unafraid to be seen as artists. Many earlier directors might have shied away from that description, but this is the era after Andrew Sarris had introduced the auteur theory. He'd kind of developed what the likes of Truffaut had said in France into an auteur theory with a pantheon of great film directors. And the likes of Scorsese are kind of coming up at a time when, they're unafraid to see themselves as artists. So the New Hollywood era, it's a body of work. It kind of differs from that classical style of American cinema in several ways. It's a time when the boundaries could be pushed. Like I said, the culture more widely is quite strained. So now there's a greater frankness that's possible in filmmaking. So you get a film like The Wild Bunch, for example, in 1969, which ends with a really graphic sequence of bloodletting. There's kind of a wider sense of cynicism that can be reflected in the content of films. Also, they have a different approach to narrative in many ways. So in old Hollywood, of course, this, there may be exceptions, but films tended to be quite plot driven. Right. You tended to have kind of a chain of events with a cause and effect relationship, characters with clear goals, and that becomes less relevant in the New Hollywood era. You get lead characters with difficult to understand motivations. There's more emphasis on ambiguity, less emphasis on closure in many of these key films. There's a different approach to film style. We'll probably talk about this in relation to The Graduate, that some key New Hollywood directors are much more willing to employ quite self-conscious arty or artistic techniques. And just another thing I wanted to highlight is that a noteworthy aspect of the work of people like Scorsese or Spielberg or Lucas is that they had quite diverse influences. So they were quite fond of classical American cinema, and they were also inspired by filmmakers from around the world. So to take Scorsese's Taxi Driver as an example, there's a shot of a fizzing glass of water in that movie, which is an homage to Jean-Luc Godard's film, 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her. And then other aspects of the film are informed by John Ford's The Searchers. So in something like Star Wars, George Lucas is drawing on varied references. Again, The Searchers is one touch point there. 1930s adventure serials, and then the Japanese film The Hidden Fortress is a big influence on the first Star Wars film. The importance of the French New Wave you can see in Spielberg's films, because he casts Francois Truffaut as the scientist in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And then you can also see the influence of old Hollywood in a movie like Jaws, where Spielberg uses the dolly zoom camera effect that is associated with Hitchcock's Vertigo. So to summarize, Raquel, so New Hollywood directors able to flourish, the structure of the film industry changed and became, at least for a time, more conducive to experimentation by filmmakers. The broader cultural climate had become more questioning, so it was kind of quite neat that the New Hollywood filmmakers were, enjoying a level of autonomy that many directors wouldn't have had in the past. Some of these directors were really passionate cinephiles and were paying homage to other films in their work. And of course, there's still a lot of points of comparison with the old Hollywood era, but there are some important differences. So we can obviously talk about this more in relation to The Graduate, but that's a whistle-stop tour, Raquel. Obviously, I've kind of had to leave out a lot there. I feel like we could have talked about that kind of shift to New Hollywood all day, but
I know, there's a lot.
I'll draw breath there and throw it over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add real quickly, you had mentioned Blow Up, and the MPA ratings came after 1967, but around the very beginning of New Hollywood. And that was instrumental in basically changing the rules of what you could show about sex, vice, and crime. So you get a lot more of those things in New Hollywood and in the films that continue into the late 1960s into the 70s. So it really opens the doors for lots of different styles of movies. And I just think about some movies that came out in the early 60s and thinking, like, if they had just been made a decade later, like in Ocean's 11 from 1960, they could have gotten away with the casino heist, but they couldn't in 1960. So it's quite a shift. So the movie we're talking about today is The Graduate. And if you haven't watched the movie, make sure you do because we will be including plenty of spoilers. So, The Graduate is based on the novel by Charles Webb, which was mostly inspired by his romance with his wife Eve Rudd. And the novel was adapted to the screen by Buck Henry and Calder Willingham and is directed by Mike Nichols. So, The Graduate stars Dustin Hoffman, and he plays Ben Braddock. Ben's just about to turn 21 years old. He's recently graduated college. He's the graduate and is heading home for the summer. Ben is entering this new phase in his life, and it's clear that he's ambivalent about a situation. He wants something different than the path that his parents expect him to take, and that's one of further education, a career, a family, and becoming a part of his parents' social circle. So at the beginning of the movie, his parents throw Ben a graduation party, and it's important to note there's none of his peers attend this party. This also happens at the birthday party later on in the film. The only attendees at this party are his parents' wealthy friends, and it's at the graduation party that Ben is approached by Mrs. Robinson, played by Anne Bancroft, and she's this beautiful, sophisticated 40-something housewife who is clearly miserable about her current situation. So Mrs. Robinson takes an interest in Ben sexually, and in convincing him to take her home from the graduation party, she commences to seduce him. And Ben is caught off guard and at first rejects her, but is intrigued enough to book a hotel room so he and Mrs. Robinson can begin their affair. Now, the older adults in Ben's life, whether it's his parents or his neighbors or Mrs. Robinson, all treat him like a plaything. He's an object for amusement, and they're constantly trying to manipulate him. He's getting pressure from his parents and Mr. Robinson to date Elaine Robinson, played by Katharine Ross. And however, Mrs. Robinson is incensed by the idea of Ben dating her daughter. It's kind of weird and makes him promise not to. But he does. And in defying Mrs. Robinson, starts this relationship with Elaine. And so he's now on this new courtship. And after quite a rocky start, Ben and Elaine start to fall in love. But things get complicated when Elaine finds out that her boyfriend slept with her mother. So Elaine is shipped off to UC Berkeley, and Ben decides to go to Berkeley and marry her. So he's basically stalking her while she's out there. And everything starts to unravel. Elaine is forced to marry another man named Carl. And when Ben finds this out, he goes on this journey, and the film ends with this iconic sequence of Ben disrupting the wedding and whisking Elaine away, and them traveling on a bus together to an uncertain future, which will go into greater length later on in this episode.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed this film. It was a pleasure to revisit it after a while, and I think it's a great example for us to use for this episode because obviously it's chronologically it's at a good time. It's 67. It's an interesting kind of turning point, but I think it shows kind of how filmmakers could be quite daring in this era. By doing so, they could attract a new audience. This film was a huge financial success, and it goes back to what I was saying about and this is an era where some of the boundaries are pushed, and this film does that, and it has some quite unusual elements I wanted to talk about. So like Benjamin is really quite an unusual protagonist, isn't he, for a comedy like this? And I think the opening kind of sets that up for us when he seems quite vacant, doesn't he? He's traveling along that conveyor belt in the airport. He's just kind of coasting through life, drifting through life. He isn't the kind of character you associate with, a romantic comedy or romantic drama. He's not the kind of attractive male lead we're going to swoon over. He isn't like a larger than life kind of anti-hero or something who we can't help but be drawn to. He's quite impassive for a lot of the film, and that's really quite interesting to me. I think Hoffman is really, really good here, isn't he? And just the casting of him kind of accentuates the sense of alienation. He doesn't seem a part of that milieu that his parents are situated within, does he? He kind of seems like an odd fit, and I think that's really interesting. But also, I think he's got incredible comic timing here as well, hasn't he?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I really enjoyed coming back to this, is that his performance is extremely good, I think. Would you agree?
Yeah, he's very anxious. He's awkward. Dustin Hoffman does a great job just depicting all of the little quirks about his character. And he's not conventionally handsome, but it's absolutely believable that he would pull both Mrs. Robinson and her daughter, Elaine, in some way. And I think the strength of the film and Dustin Hoffman's performance is the fact that we identify with him just because he's in this situation and he's trying to break out and he's kind of caught in between everything. So we're kind of drawn to him. So it's sort of believable that they both would fall for him. And I think The Graduate is fantastic in the fact that it gets better with repeat viewings. I always take away new things from each viewing. There's so many nuances, there's a lot of richness in like the visual language, so like each viewing offers more to the viewer. And it's also so strong in the fact that it's got these iconic lines and these very memorable moments. And in this recent viewing, I noticed how strong the first half of the movie is, and then that iconic ending. But the second half is quite weak. I tend to forget a lot of what happens during the second half. You could even take a nap during the second half and not really miss much, especially in the Berkeley sequences when, it kind of goes on for a while. But the fact that the first half is so strong and that ending is so strong that you forgive the film for that sort of weaker half, because like it's very much Mrs. Robinson is the first chapter and Elaine is the second chapter. So I noticed that in this recent viewing. And I also think that The Graduate is so timely because of this, like currently in our culture, this growing resentment against the rich and the powerful. You see that with the dichotomy between, or the conflict between Ben and these rich older adults. And also this push against being lost in the rat race and following this predetermined path. He says, I want something different. And a lot of young people want something different. So I think this speaks to, even though this is very much of the time in terms of its style, I think just in general, it's timeless too, just because any new generation will find something to connect to.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. And I'm going to come back to that, I think, but just on Hoffman quickly, I love how he plays those scenes before he's kind of hooked up with Mrs. Robinson, when he goes to the hotel, and just how awkward, and he's not commanding enough to hail a waiter. There's great timing with the clerk where it's about like
Buck Henry's character. Their interchange is fantastic.
Like, do you have luggage, and that all the stuff about I just have a toothbrush. Don't worry about it. It's very funny.
Or when like Buck Henry like rings the bell, and then Dustin Hoffman like covers it, and then he smacks the head. That is just like a very small moment that is so funny.
It's very, very wonderfully timed. Yeah, I had forgotten how much a young Dustin Hoffman looks quite a bit like a young Al Pacino, but I'd remembered this recently because I'd read Al Pacino's memoir, and he talks about how I think today everybody groups Pacino and De Niro together more readily, but Pacino was saying when he came along, everybody was comparing him to Dustin Hoffman, and they do look quite similar. I think young Hoffman and Pacino in like The Godfather, they're
the
quite
same
similar.
height too.
Yeah. No, I think you're talking about I think the film gets more conventional in terms of its plotting in the second half, and I think that's maybe partly.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Why? Because like I was saying earlier, characters in the new Hollywood era don't always have a clear goal, and Benjamin doesn't to begin with, but later in the movie he does, because he's decided to pursue Elaine and win her back, basically. And I would agree. I would agree that part of the film is not quite as diverting, but like you say, it's a very visually rich film. And again, going back to why this is new Hollywood and it's unusual compared to what came before, I think part of that is to do with the style of the film. So the way music is used in the film, which I'll talk more about later, but also there are shots that are unusually long. There's creative use of editing in certain sequences, like when Mrs. Robinson enters the room with Benjamin, when he's brought her purse, you get these quick shots of her body, and you get things like overlapping sound and POV shots at certain points, and you've got lots of unusual stylistic elements. Like I said, the plotting maybe gets a bit more conventional later in the film, it gets quite plot oriented, but it does build up to an iconic ending, like you say, which we'll come back to, because you get a lot of new Hollywood ambiguity around the ending, I think. Also, maybe what's unusual here is then the way that the gender roles are kind of set up, because again, if we go back to the old Hollywood era, and again, there are always exceptions, but something we associate with old Hollywood is like the older man, younger woman relationship. And here we have, obviously, like you said, a 20-year-old Benjamin. We have an older Mrs. Robinson who's pursuing him quite aggressively. I think what's interesting is like she's kind of hemmed in as well, isn't she? And I think returning to this film, it really reminded me how brilliant Anne Bancroft is in this role, because I think she really nails the different sides of the character. Like, obviously, to begin with, the the avid seductress, but I think we also really pick up on Mrs. Robinson's vulnerability as well, don't we? I mean, what do you think? Did you kind of key into that aspect of her performance and the character as well, would you say?
Yeah, she does such a great job demonstrating that her character is in the state of ennui and also on this path of self-destruction. And I don't know, it just does it so well. One thing I thought was interesting was the fact that she claims that she's an alcoholic, yet it's not demonstrated anywhere that she is an alcoholic other than having a few drinks, but we don't see her drunk. But we absolutely believe that she is an alcoholic just because we can see her on this path of self-destruction. And I don't know, Anne Bancroft, I've seen her in so many other roles. This is so different from everything else that she's done. And she is so believable as Mrs. Robinson. And there's also what's interesting about this depiction. I know it's become sort of almost a cultural meme to just refer to Mrs. Robinson to any older woman who is seducing a younger man, but we don't see her in a negative light. She is sort of the villain of the story, but there's no actual sexual shaming of her. She's just we get a little bit of her backstory and we know why she's there. So I don't know, like she's a little bit of a villain, but we also kind of empathize with her as well.
Yeah, so we get the backstory, like you say, that she's in kind of a disappointing marriage. It's a marriage that kind of arose from the fact that she got pregnant at college. And like I said earlier, with a cultural context of like the 60s, this would have been in the days before contraception was widely available that she was getting pregnant. It's a time when she wouldn't have been that. So she's in an unfulfilling marriage. It would be very difficult for her to get a divorce. This is a time when there's a lack of freedom for her. It's before the days when she'd be able to open a bank account without her husband's permission, for example. So
she's reliant on his money.
Right. She's very reliant on that. And I think, again, Bancroft's performance really effectively conveys how unfulfilled she is. And yeah, it's really relevant to what this film's doing culturally. Because like I said, 1963 is the year that The Feminine Mystique is published, where Betty Friedan wrote about the boredom of many suburban women, white suburban women after the war. So Mrs. Robinson's unhappiness is a more widespread disaffection. Benjamin is bored as well, but his boredom is something he can move past in time. It's not quite the case for Mrs. Robinson. And then Elaine is a young woman of a different generation. So it's kind of different for her. She's more able now to avoid an unplanned pregnancy, for example. And they had that quite interesting exchange at the wedding, don't they, where Mrs. Robinson says it's too late and Elaine says not for me. So it kind of speaks to that difference between the generations. And yeah, I think that theme of the generation gap is very important to this film. And it's kind of ironic because actually Anne Bancroft was only 6 years older than Dustin Hoffman. Hoffman is playing quite a bit younger. But even so, I think the fact that the adults don't have first names, it kind of underscores that generational clash.
Which is very nice touch, the young people have first names. Everyone is Mr. Robinson, Mr. Braddock, Mrs. Robinson.
Yeah, the thing I wanted to ask you about, one of the debates about The Graduate, and I think maybe actually you kind of hinted at this already, but compared to some other films of that era, it's not necessarily as explicitly radical. So a film like Easy Rider kind of wears its countercultural credentials on its sleeve much more. But that exchange about the plastics that I mentioned at the outset, I was kind of joking with, I really like that because it kind of signals a lot to you without beating you over the head with the message. Like, just in Ben's demeanor there, you can kind of read into it a critique of like American commercialism,
Yeah.
Ben telling Mr. Robinson that he doesn't respect him. There are reasons why he doesn't respect him, but the film doesn't need to spell them all out too obviously.
Right.
But it was a big debate about the film, the fact that it wasn't more of a message movie. So there was a promotional tour of the film around American colleges, and Mike Nichols said that the question that kept coming up was, why isn't the movie about Vietnam? Nichols said, quote, "You had to be outraged about Vietnam or it was shit. No matter what you were doing, if you ran a laundry, your shirts had to be outraged about Vietnam." But the politics are not at the center of The Graduate in the same way, are they?
Right.
Even when Ben ends up on Berkeley's campus, he's there pursuing Elaine, he denies being an
It's more
agitator to the
social
landlord.
politics. It's him navigating this world and his transition from youth to adulthood. And that already is so complicated that you don't actually need that backdrop of what's happening in the world.
And I think what you were saying earlier, that it's still kind of a timely film in certain ways. And I think if it had been more specifically tied to certain events of the 1960s, it could very easily feel much less timely now, in my opinion. So I like the way I like the way it engages with the cultural stuff without being too message driven about it. Those things are there if you know where to look, like I say, but the comedy in the film is very timeless. As long as people watch movies, it's going to be, really funny to sit and watch, the scene where Anne Bancroft is holding in the cigarette smoke whilst Hoffman is clumsily kissing her. That's going to be amusing to watch and to talk about as long as films are as long as the film exists, And I like that it's not it's a very culturally interesting film, but I sort of agree with kind of what Nichols is saying there, that asking it to be more about Vietnam or something is not kind of the point. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Young people will always have overbearing parents. That will always be a thing in the future. But that also could symbolize, this distrust in authority or in the government, but you don't actually need it in this world, because he already has this very strained dynamic with the older adults, especially his parents.
Yeah. Okay, Raquel, so we've got a lot of key moments and things to get through with The Graduate and other stuff. Before we get into those, is there anything else you wanted to talk about here before we go for a quick break?
No, we've covered quite a lot already.
Okay, we have indeed, and there's much more to come after the break. So we'll be back very shortly to talk more about The Graduate. Okay, everybody, welcome back. We are still talking about The Graduate in this, which is our first episode about New Hollywood on CineHistorians this season. And Raquel, key moments. There are so many, but we've selected a few, and you're going to kick us off, I think. Which one do you want to go for?
Yes, so I wanted to highlight some of the scenes involving the fish tank and the pool, because these are two very interesting visual elements that symbolize where Ben is at this part of the story, in particular at the very beginning of the story. So with the fish tank, it appears 3 to 4 minutes into the movie. Ben is at home, and it's a close-up shot of him sitting in front of his fish tank in his bedroom at his parents' house, and he has this very dejected look on his face, and he's having this conversation with his father about his future, and this is where he mentions he wants something different. And we see like the fish floating behind him in the tank, but there's also a little man in a scuba suit inside the tank as decoration. And later in the movie, we get a visual reference back to that decoration, which I'll come to soon. And to me, the fish tank symbolizes how Ben feels at this stage of his life. He feels like he's trapped in his parents' home. And now that he's a graduate fresh out of college, he's like this object of amusement, like I had mentioned earlier, for his parents and for his parents' rich friends, much like the fish are in the tank on display for the amusement of humans who gaze upon it. And the adults that are attending the graduation party for Ben all want to admire the young graduate. They're advising him on his future, like plastics, or they're maybe like patting his head, or rubbing his hair, or pinching his cheeks, welcoming him into their world of adult responsibilities. And I just feel like he's almost like a fish in the tank. He's being forced to be there. He's being forced to be on display. And as the story progresses, we learn that he wants to get out of there. He wants to do something else. And the fish tank also appears at the beginning and at the end of Ben's affair with Mrs. Robinson. So about 7 minutes into the movie, Ben escapes to his room, and this is where Mrs. Robinson steps in, and we'll get into the seduction sequence later on, but this is where that starts to begin. And she basically convinces him after several tries to drive her home. And so she throws him the keys, and she doesn't throw it quite lightly. She throws it quite past him in sort of an aggressive manner. And the keys fall into the fish tank, knocking over the decoration of the man in the scuba suit. And I think this visual is subtle, but quite effective because it already sets up Mrs. Robinson as a disruptive force in Ben's life. She's like this agent of chaos about to completely F everything up for him. And later on in the movie, when the affair comes to an end, we see Ben back at the fish tank looking inside, and he's smoking a cigarette, much like Mrs. Robinson was smoking a cigarette in that early scene in his bedroom. Now the pool is really interesting too, because it's featured a lot throughout the first half of the movie. And this is like it's a symbolic watering ground for like the community to gather around to celebrate the graduate. It's also where Ben floats around throughout the summer in like a state of malaise. He's trying to relax, but he's incredibly agitated about his affair with Mrs. Robinson and everything, that's being laid out before him. And the pool itself is also like a symbol of financial prosperity. He's in this upper class or middle upper class world. And we also notice like everyone is completely tan, like very, very tan in this movie. You can even see Mrs. Robinson with her tan lines. And that sort of symbolizes, this is a community of people who are very wealthy and can take the time to lounge around the pool. So 23 minutes in, we get a really interesting scene with the pool where it's Ben's birthday party. He's turning 21 years old, and his dad has purchased him a scuba suit for his birthday. And he's very adamant that not only does he have to wear the scuba suit, he has to come out and show everybody at the party. And again, it's none of his peers. It's only the older adults that are friends with their parents that are there. And Ben's dad, played by William Daniels, who's just great in that role, is like, I need to get my $200 worth. So then again, he's like this object of amusement. Ben comes out in a full scuba suit, and then he's made to go into the water. And there's this great sequence too, where like the camera's in the sort of like goggles of the scuba suit, and then everyone's talking, but you can't hear anything. And that's kind of mirrored later in the movie at the end. And then you see Ben in the scuba suit at the bottom of the pool, and the camera sort of pans up. And it just reminds me of that decoration in the fish tank that's at the bottom. And the suggestion is that everyone is at the surface looking down at him in his scuba suit. And then there's also some really, really great transitions between him floating on the floaty in the pool, and then him being in bed with Mrs. Robinson, and then back into the pool. And that's where he gets like this lecture from Mr. Braddock, his dad, about his future. And I think this is also a really great shot where it's the dad, and then the mom joins him, and then the Robinsons both join them, and they're in like they're obscured by the haze of the sun, and they're looking down at Ben. And this is like a pivotal point where things start to shift, because these adults are becoming very, very overbearing.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to that pool scene. I think the sound design is really strong there, isn't it? Because the kind of sound of the water is quite striking, and it adds to that feel of alienation, and just a sense of him being adrift, in quite a literal fashion there. But he's adrift at the bottom of the pool. The camera pulls away. It's really,
and then also his breathing. You can hear his breathing through the suit too.
Absolutely. Speaking of sound, I wanted to talk a bit about the music in the film. Of course, a film famous for the use of Simon and Garfunkel's songs, beginning right away in the opening sequence, but carrying on through the whole movie. So Mike Nichols said that Simon and Garfunkel, quote, sounded to me like the voice of Benjamin. And lots of critics took it that way, that the music in the film is really kind of, keying you in, keying the viewer into Ben's feelings. And as I mentioned earlier, it's quite unusual in this kind of film to have such a muted protagonist in many scenes. And so I think the music plays a very important function. So a song like The Sound of Silence really powerfully conveys the sense of alienation that the film is driving at. And I suppose a different way to do that would have been to commission somebody to write a score for the film that conveys specific things about Ben as the lead character. What's interesting about the way it's done here is that the film is actually taking some pre-existing music to help it do that. So The Sound of Silence was actually released on Simon and Garfunkel's debut album in 1964, a few years before The Graduate. That was the album Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m. There's a song in the film called April Come She Will, which is on their second album. Scarborough Fair, which we hear several times, is on the album Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme. So it's taking songs from a few, already 2 or 3 years old, and making it a part of the tapestry of the movie. Mrs. Robinson is obviously an exception because that's new for the film. It was kind of a work in progress song that had originally been about Mrs. Roosevelt and got reconfigured to be the song we know now. I just think it's an interesting film musically, and you can see it as quite an important precursor to some other films of the era that are quite youth-oriented, because popular music, the use of popular music becomes a really interesting new Hollywood, touchstone in films like Easy Rider, in films like Midnight Cowboy. These are other films about alienated characters. Of course, a film like Mean Streets, the use of pre-existing pop music is done really brilliantly there by Martin Scorsese. Yeah. So I think The Graduate's very interesting musically as well. And Mike Nichols said that he really liked, when Simon and Garfunkel brought him the song Mrs. Robinson and they hadn't worked out the verses, so they were just kind of doing dee, 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 dee. He really even just liked the provisional nature of it and felt that it was appropriate, So I think musically, this is one of the more interesting aspects of the film as well, is the way the music is utilized. And I thought it was worth highlighting, basically. Raquel, did you want to talk about the famous seduction sequence in the film?
Yeah, I won't go too far into it because there are a lot of elements, but I think this is just such a strong sequence and it delivers some of the iconic shots and also the famous line from the movie, Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me, aren't you? So the Graduate is basically famous for two things, the seduction sequence and the ending. And so the seduction sequence I find is quite interesting because it's a buildup. It's a series of scenes where Mrs. Robinson and Bancroft does such a good job in these sequences, is basically wearing Ben down. First, you get the shot of her at the party and she's eyeing her prey. Here's the young graduate being shown to everybody. And then I love how she just bursts into his bedroom. And this is when you get the shot through the fish tank. He's looking into the fish tank and you get the shot of her kind of like opening the door with great force. And she's like, oh, I was looking for the bathroom. And we know she wasn't actually looking for the bathroom. And then this verbal back and forth between them about she wants to be taken home. She doesn't have her, her husband has taken the car. She needs to be taken home. She can't drive Ben's car because she doesn't know how to drive a stick shift. So she convinces him to get home. And then she convinces him to walk her to the door because she's nervous to be alone. Then she convinces him to enter the house with her because she doesn't want to walk into a dark home. Then now it's let's have a drink by the bar. And then it's like, can you break me up my purse? And when they're at this bar, which is a nice little bar with stools, and she's sitting on one of the stools and he's sort of in the background. And this is like about 13 minutes into the movie. And this is where you get the famous leg shot. So Mrs. Robinson is at the stool at the bar and she lifts one of her legs onto like her foot onto another stool, and then the camera goes through, and then like basically we see the a triangle of her leg, and through it we see Dustin Hoffman's Ben on the other side, and that's when he delivers Mrs. Robinson, "You're trying to seduce me," and she's just laughing. And that is such an iconic sequence. It's quite provocative. It's very appealing to the eye, and I love how the leg sort of symbolizes how she's ensnared him. Now he's trapped because she has lured him in, and now he's stuck there. And she further traps him. She's like, "Hey, come look at my daughter's portrait in her room." And then suddenly the door closes, and like you had mentioned earlier, she's got no clothes on. And the buildup of this seduction sequence is so just expertly done. The back and forth between like this inexperienced and anxious young man and this woman who is toying with him and luring him is basically one of the great like cinematic exchanges. And it's really one of the major things that this movie is known for.
It is indeed. And another major thing that it's known for, as you've already mentioned, is the ending. And I'm talking about the wedding escape and then the bus ride right at the end of the film. So to recap, what happens is that Elaine and Benjamin, she has just got married to Carl, but then she decides to go with Benjamin. They fight their way out of the church and they board a bus where they sit at the back. And at first, they're all smiles, but as the scene continues, their expressions change to kind of like vacant stares. They seem much more muted. The smiles do come back and then they fade again. So it's quite an inconclusive ending. It's not the ending that was originally planned. It was intended to be a happier scene, but what Mike Nichols said was that something very odd happened to him the day we were shooting that scene. Quote, "I was rotten to the two of them. They had tears in their eyes. They were so terrified. They got on the bus and they tried to laugh and we kept rolling and they tried to laugh some more. And then they finally gave up. When I saw those rushes, I thought that's the end of the picture. They don't know what the hell to do or to think or to say to each other." So it's an interesting ending because it's been read in different ways. So some people see it as kind of a harbinger, but actually they're not meant for one another, that their relationship is ultimately doomed. Some other people think that they will stay together, but that the ending is kind of signaling that, the individuality will fade. They'll become a bit more conformist. They'll become a bit more like their parents ultimately. So it's a very new Hollywood conclusion to bring it back to how this era is somewhat different, because it's quite a deflating scene. It doesn't give you the kind of closure that you might expect from a Hollywood movie. Now, nevertheless, many audience members at the time didn't necessarily pick up on the ambiguity. What Nichols said was that he was very unnerved at preview screenings when audiences began basically to make a lot of noise and to cheer at the end of the film. He feels like audiences were expecting a happy ending and were caught up in the excitement of the escape from the church. But he felt himself that, 5 miles down the road, Elaine is going to start to say something like, "Oh my God, I haven't got any clothes with me." Or, he felt that problems would come into the picture very soon. In 5 or 10 years' time, Benjamin will be more like his parents. So interesting that they were, maybe audiences at the time didn't pick up on that straight away. But like I say, it's an ending that people have wanted to interpret and to figure out what might happen next. And one person who gave it some thought is actually Dustin Hoffman. So I watched an interview with Hoffman from the early 1990s, where he starts talking about how he's had a great idea for the sequel and that he's talked with Mike Nichols about it. So his vision was that Benjamin and Elaine would still be married. They'd now have kids, and that Benjamin would then start an affair with his son's girlfriend. So in effect, Hoffman would become the Mrs. Robinson type character, the older person having the affair with the younger person. So obviously that didn't happen. That movie was never made, but he had at least talked with Nichols about it and they tossed the idea around. So I don't know, Raquel, would you have liked to see that sequel made, do you think? Do you think that could have worked?
Well, I think it's interesting that the author, Charles Webb, actually wrote a sequel to The Graduate many years later in 2007. And he did it because Charles Webb was a very interesting character. He was very anti-money, anti-capitalism. He just did a lot of really strange things. He gave a lot of his stuff away. he did no book signings, no book events, no promotion. It's very much against that. He didn't even want any of the money that The Graduate brought him. He just like would get rid of it as quickly as possible. So he found himself in debt around 2007, and he wrote a sequel where Ben and Elaine are married and they have children, and it's another sort of like counterculture story where now they're homeschooling, now exploring the world of taking their kids out of this normal society per se and sort of raising them differently. I haven't read it, but I thought that was interesting that there is a sequel. Although it sounds like maybe Dustin Hoffman's version of a sequel might have been maybe more cinematic, like potentially, where this is more maybe just good for the confines of a novel. One thing I wanted to add though is the novel's quite interesting. I've only read a few chapters of it, but it's like very heavy on the dialogue, and a lot of that dialogue is used in the movie. Plastic doesn't appear in it, which is interesting. That was added. But Buck Henry, there were several screenwriters. Buck Henry made the biggest contribution to the final script, and in the book, Ben gets to Elaine before she says "I do." But Buck Henry changed that to the fact that she's already said "I do." She's already officially married. That's when he gets there and he's still able to whisk her away. So that sort of unsettling nature of the ending, it does actually feel like a happy ending. Like he got her just in time, but he really didn't. And they're whisked away. But now she's going to have to either get an annulment, maybe she changes her mind, and then go back to the lyrics of the song. Like they have to sit in the sound of silence and that bus contemplating their future, and it could go any different direction. I just think that's really interesting. It's very open to interpretation.
Yeah, and I like that the film hasn't, been, I'm glad that a sequel hasn't been made, because I like the fact that the ending still is very ambiguous and we can kind of ponder it.
Not everything needs a sequel.
Yeah, I think it might just have been too neat an idea to have Hoffman become Mrs. Robinson or whatever, interesting as it sounds. Okay, we come to the segment of the podcast that we call Any Other Business. So this is where we take a broader look at some other things that we haven't found a way to talk about yet about The Graduate. So, Raquel, I think you wanted to talk about the film's producer. Is that right?
Yes. So I want to talk about executive producer Joseph E. Levine. There's this amazing book called Showman of the Screen, Joseph E. Levine and His Revolutions in Film Production. It's actually right behind me on the shelf if you're watching on YouTube. It's written by A.T. McKenna. It's really fantastic. And Joseph E. Levine was the executive producer on The Graduate. He's the one who basically financed the movie and distributed through his company, Embassy Pictures. In fact, when you watch the movie and you get to the "Hello Darkness, My Old Friend" at the beginning, it says Joseph E. Levine presents. That was kind of his signature. So Levine was an interesting character. He was a producer, exhibitor, distributor, promoter. He worked on a wide range of films, everything from like big prestige pictures to low budget B movies, exploitation films. He even did a lot of sword and sandal dramas. And in the 1940s, that's when he started his distribution company, Embassy Pictures. And he became known for, at the beginning, mostly distributing international films. Like he's the reason why Two Women from 1961 was brought to the United States. And that kind of led to Sophia Loren getting her Best Actress Oscar for that film. And the book goes into detail about his involvement in The Graduate. And The Graduate was in the works as early as 1963, and the producer Lawrence Terman actually bought the rights for Charles Webb's novel and brought the project to Levine. And because no other studio would touch it, like you had mentioned earlier, Carl, the studio system is starting to fall apart. No studio would touch The Graduate, so they really had to find a different find a different independent way of making it, and that's where Joseph E. Levine comes in. And also Joseph E. Levine is the one who hired Mike Nichols for the project as well. And this was, I think, Mike Nichols' like debut project, and it's like, we'll get into detail about his success with it, but it's quite amazing that he was able to really like pick the perfect person for this. And this was a turning point in Levine's career. He was getting away from the distribution of international art house films, and he just wrapped up a multi-picture project with Paramount Pictures with Carol Baker and with The Carpetbaggers and Harlow, which The Carpetbaggers did well, but that had a huge scandal surrounding it. And then Harlow was a disaster because it was Carol Baker playing this biopic about Jean Harlow. But that same year, there was another movie called Harlow, starring Carol Lindley, about Jean Harlow. So that was a huge disaster. So The Graduate really kind of saves Joseph E. Levine's career. It kind of saves Embassy Pictures too. And Embassy Pictures ends up getting purchased. So The Graduate was a low budget movie. And Terman actually convinced Levine, hey, I'll make it for $1 million, more so than they had thought. And Levine trusted him. In fact, Levine was very, very in admiration of both Terman and Nichols. So when the budget ended up going to $3.2 million, he was okay with it because he knew that there was something good to come out of it. And Levine was a promoter at heart. And even before the movie was in production, he was quoted as saying, Mike Nichols is a genius, and we may really have ourselves something here. And he predicted that this movie was going to be really great. And what's interesting too about Levine, which you'll learn when you read the book, and I'll have a link to my book review if you want to learn more about the book, is that Levine really had a finger on the pulse of what was popular at the time. And one of the things about New Hollywood in particular is that there was a sense that these movies had to start to appeal to an under 30 crowd. And that's what these New Hollywood films did. They appealed to a younger audience who maybe wanted something with like traditional elements, but wanted to have different types of stories, something that they could identify with. And he was really good at tapping into that.
Yep. Great stuff. And Raquel, I'm going to do something now, which is normally your job on the podcast, which is to recommend a potential double bill to viewers, because I know that you like to do that, but I'm going to recommend a potential double bill with another 1967 New Hollywood movie, which is Bonnie and Clyde. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about Bonnie and Clyde because it's a very interesting New Hollywood film. It reflects a lot of the things we've been talking about on this episode, that the film industry was in transition, that there were these broader cultural uncertainties. So Bonnie and Clyde, directed by Arthur Penn, and it's very much tapping into the moment in certain ways. So Arthur Penn wanted the image of, spoiler alert, Clyde's head being blown away at the end of the movie by a bullet. He wanted that image to remind audiences of some of the violent events in the news in recent years, like the shooting of President Kennedy. So although it's a retro gangster film, it's kind of tapping into what's going on more recently. So the film was made for Warner Brothers, and Jack Warner's still around, and his attitude to Bonnie and Clyde, again, it's speaking to the transitional nature of the times. So in June 1967, Arthur Penn and Warren Beatty screen an early cut of the film for Jack Warner at his home. And at the outset, Warner reportedly says to Penn, I'll tell you something right now. If I have to go pee, this picture stinks. And then after 5 or 6 minutes of the preview, Jack Warner gets up, he leaves the room to relieve himself, and he does this on 2 other occasions before the movie is over. So after the lights go up, Jack Warner says, that's the longest 2 hours and 10 minutes I ever spent. It's a free piss picture. And Beatty tries to defend the film. He's saying, look, you know what, Jack, this is really kind of an homage to the Warner Brothers gangster films of the 1930s, you know? And Warner supposedly replies, what the fuck's a homage? So it's kind of talking to, you know, it's saying a lot there about the generational clash that's going on there, the transitional moment. And then the film comes out, and Bosley Crowther of the New York Times, veteran critic, eccentric taste from our perspective in the modern day, he reviews Bonnie and Clyde and he slates it. He calls it a cheap piece of bald-faced slapstick. And this is a man who generally had a problem with the increasing violence in films. He didn't like The Dirty Dozen for that reason. He didn't like Point Blank for that reason. And to be fair to him, he wasn't the only reviewer to take against Bonnie and Clyde to begin with. But Pauline Kael really championed the film. She called it the most excitingly American movie since The Manchurian Candidate. And she mounts something of a campaign to rehabilitate the film's reputation. The film does unspectacular business commercially in America at first. It did much better in the UK, interestingly, and
Oh.
Bonnie's beret started a bit of a fashion trend. Um, then what happens is in December of 1967, so this is after the film had stopped playing in cinemas, Time magazine puts it on the cover, and it's an article about the new cinema. And off the back of that, Beatty was able to argue that the film should be re-released. And the re-release happens on the same day that the Academy Award nominations are announced. And Bonnie and Clyde got 10 nominations. And then the re-release is much more successful. So it's quite an interesting story, I think. And the film is an important example of new Hollywood filmmaking because it has quite a distinctive approach to the gangster genre. It has some of the things we've talked about in relation to The Graduate, like attention grabbing editing and photography and performances. And yeah, ultimately a film that after a slow start became a big success with the ticket buying public. So I think a big new Hollywood success story. And like I said, Raquel, potentially quite an interesting double bill historically with The Graduate, I would say. So yeah.
And I have to say, Bosley Crowther loved The Graduate. So I think it's really interesting that
interesting.
Pans Bonnie and Clyde. And Bonnie and Clyde is also like The Graduate, has those iconic sequences and lines. I'm trying to remember Faye Dunaway's line, like "We rob banks" or something like that. And then also that shot of them looking at each other right before the bullets start to spray always sticks in my mind. So both of these really stand out as these stories of these outsiders in this precarious situation, two different, very precarious situations, and do so very stylishly.
Yes, and I'm going to come back to the Academy Award ceremony from that year. But before I do, Raquel, you wanted to introduce something else to the discussion, I think.
Yes, so I want to put everyone on to what I consider the best documentary of all time. I'm very, very biased here because I really love this documentary. It's called Harold and Lillian, A Hollywood Love Story. It's directed by Daniel Rame, and it's about Harold and Lillian Michelson, who are a married couple who work together and separately in the film industry over 6 decades. Harold Michelson died several years ago. Lillian Michelson's still with us. So they worked on hundreds of films. Like Harold Michelson was a storyboard artist and a production designer, and Lillian Michelson was a researcher. And what the documentary does is it chronicles not only their love story, but their career in Hollywood, both together and separately. And it's fascinating because it really gives you appreciation for how the people below the line, people who are not the director, not the producer, not the screenwriter, not the credited cast, but people below the line actually contribute to the making of the film. And it's astonishing how much the Michelsons have contributed to film history and how much of their work goes uncredited. Everyone I've talked to about this documentary loves it. I've been a big champion of the documentary since I saw it about 9 years ago. I've even become friends with the director, the producer, and Lillian herself. It's just so wonderful. But what I think is interesting about the documentary is that it covers a lot of films that they worked on. And I actually created a Letterboxd list for this episode just so you can see how many films are mentioned in the documentary, films that the Michelsons worked on. And they worked on numerous new Hollywood films: Rosemary's Baby, Bonnie and Clyde, which you just talked about, Chinatown, Johnny Got His Gun, which is one of my personal favorites, and then The Graduate, like what we're talking about today. So if you watch Harold and Lillian, there's a 7-minute segment where they talk about how they contributed to The Graduate, more so how Harold Michelson's storyboard art crafted some of the iconic shots. It's about 48 minutes into the documentary. So if you're looking for that, that's where you'll find it. And the documentary has archival footage of Harold Michelson talking about how Mike Nichols reached out to him at Paramount to read the book and help him pre-visualize different scenes. Michelson had developed a reputation at this point for his sort of deep understanding for perspective and camera angle and taking an idea and knowing how it could visually work best on screen. Like he had a special talent for this. And in the archival footage, he talks about the different sequences he worked on, a lot of the fun transitions from the bedroom to the pool and back, or the scene where you see Ben in the bed, I think drinking a beer, and then Mrs. Robinson goes back and forth across the foreground. There's a lot of foreground background shots where she is putting on clothes, and with each pass of the her passing the camera each time, there's more and more clothes on her, which I think is a really arresting shot. And then even like with the ending with Ben at the church, sort of like a Christ-like figure banging on the window, that was also pre-visualized in storyboard art by Harold Michelson. And there's a lot of interviews in the documentary. And one I thought was really interesting. It had a quote from film historian Bill Crone, who said, Harold must have seen a lot of Fellini at that point and New Wave, because whoever made The Graduate really knew the evolving visual language of that period very well, which I think is really interesting. And the biggest revelation in the documentary is that Harold Michelson came up with the famous leg shot. And he's quoted as saying, The Graduate, there's this one scene, and I decided to have in the foreground the angle of her leg, which created a triangle, and put Dustin Hoffman in between. We saw him immediately, and you also get the feeling of a sexual escapade. It worked, and they did it that way. Now, I have heard from another source who claims that it wasn't Harold Michelson who came up with it, that it's difficult because is it his idea? Is it a combination of him working with Nichols? There was a lot of rehearsals where Mike Nichols would have his cast on a stage. They sort of do a makeshift room based off whatever they were working on. And he'd have Harold Michelson at his side, basically drawing out possible scenarios and possible shots. So to me, it seems very likely, because Harold Michelson had so much storyboard artwork that he shows in the archival footage in the documentary of the famous leg shot and of the famous other scenes, that to me, it seems more likely that Michelson was either the inspiration behind these shots or at least heavily involved. So I think that's really interesting. And I just highly recommend anyone watch this documentary. Anyone who loves film history, you'll take away a lot from it. And also it's just a very sweet love story.
Great stuff. I confess I haven't seen the documentary, so I was aware that you're a big champion of it. So I need to remedy that at some point in the very near future, don't I? Before I do, though, I'm going to bring things back to the 1968 Academy Awards and what happened with The Graduate there. So the film is released at the end of 1967. It's then nominated for 7 Oscars at the following Academy Awards in 1968, and it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor for Hoffman, Best Actress for Bancroft, Best Supporting Actress for Katharine Ross, Best Director for Mike Nichols, Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Cinematography, and the cinematographer was Robert Surtees. Just the one win for Mike Nichols for Best Director, and he had a very good awards season, actually, because he won Best Director from the Directors Guild of America, he won Best Director at the BAFTAs, he won other awards as well, so he did very well. And I think a deserved win. It is a very cleverly directed film, I think. It manages to be appealing to a mainstream audience whilst also incorporating, like we said, more unusual, self-conscious artistic techniques. And I think, he's very astute at using cinematic language to carry some of the meanings here. So an example for me here would be the scene in the hotel between Benjamin and Mrs. Robinson, where they have that long discussion about her marriage, and at the end of the scene, things have started to get a bit less heated. They're both undressing again. There's a fade to black. But I think it's notable that they're now both facing away from one another as the scene ends. There's now a distance between them.
Yeah.
And the positioning of the actors within the frame kind of signals that. One of the reasons I think the Oscars from that year are so interesting, because I think they really are indicative of that old-new dichotomy of the film industry transitioning to new Hollywood. So you've got Bonnie and Clyde up for Best Picture. You've got The Graduate up for Best Picture. These are really like modern upstarts, Mm-hmm. They're up against In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and then also the overblown musical Dr. Dolittle. And I've just read a book recently by the critic Tim Roby called Box Office Poison about some of the biggest flops in Hollywood history. And there's a great chapter in there about how much of a folly Dr. Dolittle really was. Oh. So I'll quickly recommend that. But In the Heat of the Night won the main Best Picture award. But I think, you sort of come away from that year's Oscars thinking that definitely Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate are real kind of watersheds in this transition to New Hollywood. And both Raquel and I are interested, I think, in the history of the Oscars. And it's quite interesting to look at the nominees from that period, not just that year, but from around that time, because it kind of gives you an insight into how there's this kind of continuity with old Hollywood at the same time as there's kind of a coexistence with the newer generation. So I think it's 1970, for example, when John Wayne wins the Best Actor Oscar for True Grit. And, it's a year when in that category, some of the other nominees are Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight for Midnight Cowboy. So you really do see kind of the old guard and the new guard sitting alongside one another in some of those ceremonies from around that time. I just wanted to highlight that really, that just the one Oscar for The Graduate, I think a deserved one. And like I said, I think the one of the things that's interesting about things like awards, Raquel, is it kind of, you can sort of chart the history of cinema through what gets up for awards at certain points, can't you? And sort of see the way things change over time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that I had read Mike Nichols was only the 7th director at that point to be nominated for an Oscar for a debut film. Okay. And the fact that he won for his debut film is quite impressive.
Absolutely. And we're going to draw things to a close here, I think. It's been fascinating, Raquel, to unpick The Graduate with you. And like I said at the beginning, it's the first part of a two-parter on New Hollywood to round off our debut season. And if there are any Murray Hamilton superfans out there, it's your lucky day, because he's not just Mr. Robinson in The Graduate, but he's also in the film that's coming up on our next episode. And Raquel, do you want to tease people? Do you want to tell people what the film is that's coming up next time?
Yeah, so for this Murray Hamilton double bill, we're talking about Jaws.
Yeah, so another film. So we talked about the importance of water in the fish tank, in The Graduate, and the pool. And yes. There's a connection there with just when you thought it was safe to...
Everything connects.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to recording that episode with you. Just before we go, a quick reminder, listeners, that we would love you to rate and review the podcast. So if you're listening to us just on the audio version on the likes of Apple and Spotify, we'd love a quick one-line review. We'd love a 5-star rating. It would help us reach more, more film fans, more cinephiles. And what about on YouTube, Raquel? What can people do over there to help us out?
They can smash the subscribe button, hit the like button, and turn on notifications for future episodes.
Fantastic. All right. So we're going to, like I say, we're drawing to a close now with The Graduate episode. We'll be back very soon talking about Jaws. Thank you, everybody, if you've listened to this episode of CineHistorians. Bye now.
Bye.
You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.